Pop Smoke's killer is back on camera making an insane claim. Years after walking free for his role in the rapper's murder, he's bragging that he's been tied to 4 murder cases and somehow beaten them all. But how he kept escaping serious time is even more shocking. Let's get into it. It's the kind of clip that stops your scroll. A young man, calm, almost proud, tells an interviewer he's 23. He's got 4 murders on his resume, and he's still out here. No handcuffs, no courtroom, just a microphone and a camera crew. Pop Smoke's convicted killer says he's beaten 4 murder cases despite being convicted in the 2020 killing of the rapper. That's the line making the rounds. A killer who's already served time for taking a rising star's life, now sitting in front of a camera, talking about it like a stat line. Here's what makes it land so hard. This isn't some anonymous internet troll cosplaying as a criminal for clout. This is one of the 4 people who broke into a Hollywood Hills mansion in February 2020 and left a 20-year-old rapper dead on the bathroom floor. Pop Smoke, real name Bashar Baraka Jackson, had just landed in Los Angeles days earlier. He was riding the highest wave of his career. Welcome to the Party had turned him into New York's newest voice. Travis Scott, Nicki Minaj, Lil Baby, everybody wanted a piece of the Brooklyn sound he'd built almost overnight. Then 4 intruders showed up at his rental home before dawn, and none of that mattered anymore. Now, years later, one of the men tied to that home invasion is out, filming himself and talking about murder like it's a flex instead of a life sentence he escaped. The specifics of who's saying what get messy fast because there were 4 separate people involved, 4 separate court outcomes, and at least 2 of them have now sat down for recorded interviews since walking out of custody. One of them, who went by the name Blockstar in these sit-downs, told No Jumper host Adam22 flatly that he wasn't sorry for anything that happened that night. He said it should never have happened, but that he wouldn't take it back if he could go back. He even brought up that Pop Smoke rapped about violence himself, using that to shrug off any guilt. That's the same young man authorities couldn't legally name in court documents because he was a minor at the time of the killing. But he's had no problem naming himself and detailing his own version of events once the cameras started rolling. That's the moment this story really opens up, because the 4 murders boast didn't come from nowhere. It came from someone who has now sat in multiple recorded conversations, laughing about a night that ended a young man's life, describing himself as having beaten case after case, and doing it all while free to walk into any studio that will have him. To understand how someone involved in killing Pop Smoke ends up bragging about 4 bodies on camera, instead of sitting in a cell for the rest of his life, you have to go back to the beginning, to the night the robbery went wrong, to the 4 names investigators eventually connected to it, and to a justice system that treated 3 of those 4 as children first and killers second. Because here's the thing that makes this so infuriating for a lot of people watching these clips resurface. One of 4 people charged in connection with the fatal shooting of rapper Pop Smoke in Hollywood Hills pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter. Not murder, manslaughter. That's the word prosecutors settled for with more than one of the men involved in this case. And it's a big part of why some of them are out, filming themselves, years before most people expected. The night itself moved fast. A 911 call from a friend of someone in the house reported armed intruders inside the home, and the robbers knew the address, because a day earlier, Jackson had posted a photograph on social media of a gift bag he had received with the address on a label. 4 masked men. One mistake on Instagram, that's all it took for the location of a rented mansion to end up in the wrong hands. Jackson was in the shower when masked robbers confronted him, and during a struggle, one attacker, who was 15, pistol whipped the rapper and shot him 3 times in the back. 3 shots in the back, while he was cornered, unarmed, in his own bathroom. The attacker stole Jackson's diamond-studded Rolex watch and sold it for $2,000, a detective testified. $2,000. That's the number attached to the watch that got a 20-year-old shot to death. A number so small compared to what he was worth alive that it's almost impossible to sit with. That's the setup. That's the crime the man now bragging about 4 murders on camera was a part of. And what happened to each of the 4 people involved after that night tells you everything about why one of them feels comfortable enough to talk about murder, like it's a personal brand. Let's slow down and walk through exactly what happened, because the details matter. They're the reason 4 different legal outcomes came out of one single night. Pop Smoke was in Los Angeles on a 4-day trip while renting a home in the Hollywood Hills. He wasn't hiding from anybody. He was a 20-year-old artist enjoying the fruits of a career that had exploded almost overnight. Doing what young stars do when they land in LA? Posting, moving, living out loud on social media? That openness is exactly what got him killed. Investigators believe the defendants became aware of Pop Smoke's whereabouts after his social media posts showed the house he was renting. In the early morning hours of February 19, 2020, 4 men, some accounts describe them wearing masks, broke into that rental home. Pop Smoke was a rising star when his ski mask-wearing killers broke into the Airbnb and confronted him while he was in the shower. There was no time to react, no time to call for help beyond the friend who eventually dialed 911. Jackson tried to fight back once the intruders demanded his jewelry, and that resistance turned a robbery into a killing. A 15-year-old, the youngest of the 4 intruders, allegedly admitted to killing Jackson over a diamond-studded Rolex during a recorded interview with a cellmate at a juvenile detention center, telling the cellmate that Jackson at first complied with their requests for jewelry, but then tried to fight them, and a confrontation broke out in which Jackson was pistol-whipped and shot with a Beretta 92. That confession, recorded not by police, but by a fellow inmate who happened to be listening, became one of the most damning pieces of evidence in the entire case. It wasn't a forced statement. It was a teenager casually describing how he'd killed someone, the same way you'd expect someone to brag about a video game. Investigators moved fast once they had a case built. By July 2020, 4 names were attached to the crime. 2 adults, Corey Walker and Keandre Rogers. 2 minors, ages 17 and 15, whose identities were shielded by the court. Corey Walker and Keandre Rogers were each charged with murder, with the special circumstance allegation that the murder occurred during the commission of a robbery and a burglary, making them eligible for the death penalty eligibility. That's how serious this looked on paper in the summer of 2020. 2 men in their late teens and early 20s facing the possibility of execution. 2 more facing juvenile court proceedings that would ultimately determine how much of their lives they'd actually lose. But policy changed before any of that death penalty talk turned into reality. New DA George Gascon later instituted a policy of not pursuing the death penalty, which took the most extreme outcome off the table for every defendant in this case, adults included. From that point forward, this was always going to be a story about plea deals, sentencing ranges, and how the California juvenile system treats teenagers who commit adult crimes. That distinction, adult court versus juvenile court, is the single biggest reason this case produced such wildly different outcomes for 4 people who were in that house together. Of the 4 people involved in Pop Smoke's murder, only 2 were legally adults at the time. The other 2, ages 15 and 17, were shielded by a legal framework built to rehabilitate children, not punish them the way adult courts punish adult killers. This is where the story starts splitting into 4 completely different paths, and where the seeds of that 23-4 murders still out boast actually get planted. Because juvenile court in California comes with a hard ceiling. No matter how brutal the crime, no matter how much of a role a teenager played in a killing, the system caps their custody at age 25. California law prohibits juveniles from being held past age 25. Think about what that actually means. A 15-year-old who pulls the trigger 3 times into someone's back can at most be confined until his 25th birthday. Regardless of the sentence handed down on paper, that's the legal ceiling that shaped every single outcome for the 3 minors in this case. And it's the exact loophole that let one of them walk out young enough to still be bragging about it on camera years later. The teenage shooter, the one who confessed to his cellmate, eventually admitted his role in open court. The teen triggerman admitted in May 2023 that he shot the celebrated Dior rapper born Bashar Baraka Jackson during a home invasion robbery around 4 a.m. on February 19, 2020. On paper, the number attached to his conviction sounds enormous. He was sentenced to 50 years to life in prison, but under California law, the maximum age for juvenile detention is 25 years old. 50 years to life reduced, in practice, to a sentence that expires the moment he turns 25. That's not a technicality buried in legal footnotes. That's the entire reason a killer who shot someone 3 times in the back can and will walk free while still young enough to have a full life ahead of him. The second minor, 17 at the time of the killing, took a different route entirely. The eldest of the juveniles, who was 17 years old at the time, admitted to voluntary manslaughter and home invasion robbery at a hearing in April 2023. Manslaughter, not murder. That downgrade from a killing charge to a lesser one is the legal difference between decades in custody and a handful of years. Judge J. Christopher Smith sentenced the now 20-year-old defendant to 4 years and 2 months in a juvenile treatment facility, after the man pled guilty to entering the Hollywood Hills mansion to rob the late rapper before things ended in bloodshed. 4 years and 2 months for a home invasion that ended in someone's death. The judge refused to reduce his sentence by 2 years and 8 months, the time he'd already spent behind bars, and warned the man he could remain in juvenile custody until he was 25. That's the defendant who would eventually go by Blockstar once he was free. The same voice behind the 4 murders line making the rounds now. But before we get to what he said, since walking out, there's a third minor and 2 adults whose fates diverge just as sharply, and together all 4 paths explain exactly how this case produced a free man boasting about bodies on camera. If you only remember one thing about this case, remember this: 4 people were in that house, and no 2 of them ended up with the same punishment. That gap between what each of them actually did and what each of them actually served is the entire reason this story keeps resurfacing years later. Start with the 2 adults, because their outcomes couldn't be more different from each other. Corey Walker was 19 at the time of the killing and described by prosecutors as the one who led the group to the rental home that morning. Corey Walker, accused of leading 3 juveniles to the rented Airbnb the morning of the shooting, pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter and home invasion robbery with gun and gang enhancements. That plea came nearly 5 years after the killing itself, after years of pre-trial hearings, delayed trial dates, and failed settlement talks. Kellen Davis, a lawyer for Walker, told Newsweek that his initial August trial date did not happen after a disposition fell through from the higher-ups in the district attorney's office, and a disposition was possible going forward, but seemed unlikely at the time. That uncertainty ended in early 2025. Walker pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter and home invasion robbery with gun and gang enhancements, and was due to be sentenced to 29 years in prison. 29 years, the harshest outcome of the 4, and the only sentence handed down in adult court where there's no age 25 ceiling waiting to cut it short. Prosecutors dropped a murder charge under the deal, and the new voluntary manslaughter charge included the aggravating factors that the crime was carried out with planning, and a high degree of cruelty, viciousness, and callousness. Cruelty and viciousness. Those are the words a prosecutor chose to describe planning a robbery on a Rising Stars rental home. Walker, now in his mid-20s, is the only one of the 4 defendants who will spend the majority of his adult life behind bars for this. Then there's Keandre Rogers, the other adult originally charged, and by far the murkiest thread in this entire case. Corey Walker and Keandre Rogers were each charged with murder, with the special circumstance allegation that the killing occurred during the commission of a robbery and a burglary, making them eligible for the death penalty. That's how serious his exposure looked in 2020. But years later, his case still hasn't produced a public resolution the way the other 3 have. Keandre Rogers, then 18, was initially charged with murder, but his case is currently under review. Under review years after the killing, years after his 3 co-defendants have all reached final outcomes. That's not a footnote. That's an active, unresolved thread in a case everyone assumed was closed. While Walker sits with a fixed 29-year sentence and the 2 minors have already served out juvenile time, Rogers remains the one name in this case without a clean ending. His legal fate still being sorted out in the background while headlines move on to everything else. Now the 2 minors, the ones whose age at the time of the crime activated that hard 25-year ceiling in California's juvenile system. The 17-year-old, later known publicly as Blockstar, got his 4 years and 2 months and was gone by comparison to Walker's decades. He didn't disappear quietly once he was out either. He went on No Jumper and told Adam 22 he wasn't sorry. "I'm not sorry about nothing," Blockstar stated, adding, "It should have never happened, but I ain't sorry." He went further, framing the entire crime as something he'd repeat if given the chance. "If I could go back, I'd go back." He justified it partly by pointing to Pop Smoke's own music. People die every day. Pop Smoke was rapping about it, all types of stuff. So, I ain't sorry about it. That interview drew instant backlash from inside hip-hop media itself. DJ Akademiks publicly called the sit-down tasteless, saying it glamorized exactly the kind of behavior it shouldn't be feeding to young audiences. A stance that landed harder, given Akademiks' own history covering Chicago drill violence years earlier and later admitting he'd grown past that approach. There was a third minor too, 16 at the time, whose case moved with far less public attention. The third juvenile, 16 at the time, also settled his case and was sent to a post-conviction juvenile housing facility. No viral interviews attached to his name. No podcast appearances. Just a quiet plea deal, and a facility placement that barely made headlines compared to his co-defendants. So line up the four outcomes side by side. One adult with 29 years locked in, one adult whose case is still unresolved years later, one minor who served roughly 4 years and came out talking to podcasts about not being sorry, and one more minor, the youngest of the group, the one who actually pulled the trigger 3 times, whose story was far from over the moment he walked into juvenile custody. Because while Walker's sentence was getting finalized and Blackstar was already out doing interviews, the 15-year-old shooter was sitting inside a facility that was about to become the site of an entirely new crime. One that would add a fresh current chapter to a case people thought had already reached its ending. Here's where this story stops being about 2020 and starts being about right now. Because the actual shooter, the one who pistol-whipped Pop Smoke and put 3 bullets in his back, didn't just serve his time quietly. He got caught committing an entirely new crime while locked up, and it happened just months before these clips of a co-defendant bragging about 4 murders started spreading again. His name is DJ Jester. Jester was 15 at the time of the killing and was convicted of Jackson's murder in 2023. He'd been held at Barry J. Nidorf Juvenile Hall in Sylmar, a facility that, according to prosecutors, has its own history of problems. After his conviction for the homicide, Jester was confined in the Sylmar facility, which has been beset with drug abuse, violence, and absent staff. That environment set the stage for what happened next. While Jester was serving his sentence, prosecutors say his mother, Nikia Tyonia Randall, visited him and allegedly attempted to pass him 2 latex balls containing fentanyl pills. Not a single pill. Not a small mistake. Authorities recovered one of the balls and found 25 fentanyl pills inside. 25 fentanyl pills, allegedly smuggled in by his own mother during a visit meant to be a moment of family connection inside a juvenile facility. An investigative report cited by the Los Angeles Times said guards saw Randall attempt to pass Jester a balloon containing 25 blue pills and a small amount of blue powder. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision either. Investigators later reviewed footage from previous visits and recorded calls in which Jester and his mother allegedly discussed bringing contraband into the facility. Planned, discussed over recorded calls, attempted during an in-person visit. This is a young man who was already serving time for one of the most talked about murders in modern hip-hop, running an entirely separate operation from inside the walls meant to hold him accountable. The case moved through the courts quickly compared to the years the original murder trial dragged on. Jester pleaded no contest on June 23 to 1 count each of possession of a controlled substance for sale, bringing contraband into a jail, and bringing or sending contraband into a juvenile facility. And then came the sentencing, delivered just days before this script was written. DJ Jester, one of the individuals convicted in the murder of rapper Pop Smoke, has been sentenced to 4 years in prison for smuggling fentanyl into a juvenile detention center in Los Angeles County. 4 more years, stacked directly on top of the murder conviction that already had him locked up. Jester received a 7-year commitment in juvenile custody for his role in the Pop Smoke case, and now he's picked up a second felony conviction before that original sentence had even finished playing out. District Attorney Nathan Hochman didn't hold back when discussing what this new case represented. He was given the chance at rehabilitation by serving 7 years in a juvenile hall, but he chose to smuggle in fentanyl, Hochman said. A chance at rehabilitation wasted on drug trafficking from inside the very system built to give him a second shot at life. Here's the twist that makes this piece of the story land so hard, though. Because of that same 25-year ceiling baked into California's juvenile law, this new felony doesn't extend his overall time behind bars nearly as much as you'd expect. California law prohibits juveniles from being held past age 25, so Jester's sentence aligns with this rule, and the new charge will result in his transfer to a state prison once he reaches the maximum juvenile detention age. Translation, he ages out of the juvenile system regardless. And the fentanyl conviction simply determines what facility picks him up next, not whether he walks free young. The shooter who actually killed Pop Smoke will still be released relatively young by any adult sentencing standard. Just now, it'll happen inside a state prison instead of a juvenile hall. And this is exactly where the 4 murders boast starts to make uncomfortable sense as part of a bigger pattern. You've got one co-defendant already out, filming interviews, telling podcasts he's not sorry. You've got another co-defendant's case still unresolved years later. You've got the actual shooter committing a brand new felony while locked up for the murder itself. And running underneath all of it is a system where a killing that ended a young man's career and life results in outcomes ranging from decades in prison to a walk out the door before age 25. That's the environment that produced a man comfortable enough to sit in front of a camera and treat surviving murder charges like a badge of honor. Not because the system failed to convict. It clearly did convict multiple times over. But because the punishment attached to those convictions for 3 of the 4 people involved was capped by an age limit instead of by the severity of what they'd actually done. Which brings the story to where it started. Back to the interview, back to the camera, back to a 23-year-old talking about 4 murders like he's reciting a highlight reel instead of a rap sheet. So here's where all 4 threads come back together. The ringleader locked in for decades, the co-defendant whose case still isn't resolved, the shooter picking up new felonies from inside custody, and the one who's out, on camera, turning all of it into content. Blockstar's release wasn't quiet. Once he was free, he didn't retreat from public attention, he leaned into it. Clips of him flaunting his release circulated on social media almost immediately. And it wasn't long before he sat down for the no-jumper interview that first put his voice and his lack of remorse in front of a national audience. He told Adam 22 the killing was never a setup, insisting nobody sent them and nobody planned to hurt anyone specifically. He said it plainly. It was a robbery. Nobody sent us. Nobody did none of that. That's all false information, claiming that he and his co-defendants had no intention of killing Pop Smoke. He even said outright that he didn't think anyone would be home that night, framing the entire tragedy as a robbery that spiraled out of control rather than a targeted attack. Nobody was intended to get hurt, he said. We were just kids being kids, kids from the hood. There was too much movement, too much going on. It wasn't intentional. Blockstar served a few years in jail and believed his sentence was too light, though he didn't suggest what would have been a more appropriate punishment. That last detail is worth sitting with. Even the man who served the shortest sentence among the 4 defendants has said on record that what he got wasn't enough. And yet here he is, still doing interviews, still talking about the night that ended Pop Smoke's life like it's part of his personal legend now. The same energy that eventually produced the boast about beating 4 murder cases while still being only 23 years old and free. It's worth remembering what that number is actually built on. This isn't 4 separate murder victims claimed in one sitting. It's a young man who cycled through the justice system enough times, tied to this case and reportedly others, that he can stand in front of a camera and frame surviving all of it as proof of something rather than a warning sign. And the platform keeps giving him the microphone. Because clips like that travel fast, and podcasts built on shock value know exactly what kind of attention a line like 23 years old, 4 murders still out is going to generate online. Meanwhile, Pop Smoke's family has had to watch every one of these interviews land in their timeline right alongside memories of their son. His mother, Audrey Jackson, has spoken about how untouched his room has remained, how she hasn't been able to bring herself to listen to his music the way she used to years after losing him. That's the side of this story that never gets the same view count as a killer's podcast clip. A mother still living inside a grief that hasn't gotten quieter just because the court cases eventually closed. And they haven't all closed. Roger's case, sitting under review, means this story genuinely isn't finished yet. There's no guarantee his outcome will match Walker's 29 years, or the minor's juvenile sentences, or anything in between. Whatever happens with him will add a 5th chapter to a case that already produced 4 wildly different endings from one single night. What's left, when you put it all together, is a killing that took less than a minute to happen and years to fully prosecute. 4 defendants processed through 2 entirely different legal systems, adult and juvenile, with punishments ranging from decades in prison to a release before age 25. One of those released men has turned his survival of that system into content, sitting for interviews where he shows zero remorse and treats his own history of violence like currency instead of shame. Another co-defendant is behind bars for an entirely new crime committed while serving time for the first one. And the case that put all of them in the same courtroom, all those years ago, still has an unresolved thread running through it right now, in real time, with no clean ending in sight. Pop Smoke was 20 years old when he died in that bathroom. 3 shots in the back, over a watch that sold for $2,000. Everything that's happened since, the plea deals, the age 25 ceiling, the fentanyl smuggling, the podcast interviews, the boast about 4 murders on camera, all of it is still unfolding around the absence he left behind. The story didn't end when the last plea deal was signed.